ledger didn't just reveal a name, it revealed a crime. A judge tried to erase his own baby to protect his powerful name, and an entire town chose silence over innocence. Until one night, a lone cowboy heard a cry in the darkness that was never meant to be heard. What he uncovered didn't just save a life, it shattered a legacy, and exposed a town built on lies. The wind howled through the barren land, a sharp, biting chill settling over the wilderness as the last remnants of daylight disappeared into the endless black of a November evening. The scent of pine and damp earth clung to the cold air, mingling with the scent of dust and decay. The landscape, once vibrant with life, now stood still, as though nature itself had decided to hold its breath, waiting for something that would never come. In the distance, the dark silhouette of a cabin loomed, small and lonely, nestled on the outskirts of a town that had once been filled with the sounds of traders, miners, and the bustling promises of the frontier. Now the town was little more than a ghost, its streets quiet, its hopes extinguished in the dry winds of a forgotten history. Inside the cabin, the flickering light of a dying fire cast long, wavering shadows across the walls. The warmth was fleeting, struggling to stay alive against the encroaching cold of the wilderness. And in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, there sat a sack, folded, crumpled, abandoned. It lay motionless, as if it too had given up, a burden cast aside by fate itself. In that sack, hidden from the world, a small, fragile life stirred. A baby, no more than a few weeks old, who had been left to die in the cold embrace of the night. The baby's cries were faint, barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the vast emptiness that surrounded it. There was no one to hear, no one to care. Each sob seemed to fall into the dark expanse of the wilderness, only to be lost in the wind. The harsh cold seeped into the cabin, threatening to silence the small voice forever. The fire sputtered, and the warmth of life began to fade, leaving the child alone in the bitter quiet. And yet the baby's cries lingered, fragile and desperate, as if they had been cast into the world with the hope that someone, anyone, would hear. The town itself had long since turned away. It had been a place of hope once, a hub for those seeking fortune and a new life. But now the streets were empty, the windows dark, and the whispers of despair filled the silence. Traders who had once set up shop under the wide sky now only left behind memories, faded and forgotten, buried beneath the dust. Miners who had come seeking treasure had found only empty promises. And the people, those who remained, hid their faces behind the veneer of civility, too afraid to speak of the horrors they knew too well, too ashamed to acknowledge what had been cast aside. No one spoke of the child. No one asked why it had been left there, abandoned in a world that had no use for its innocence. And yet the questions hung in the air, unanswered as the cold night pressed in. Who had left the child there? Why? Was it an act of desperation or cruelty? Was the baby truly forgotten, or was there something deeper, a secret buried beneath the surface, hidden from the eyes of those who might have cared? The answers would never come, not yet, not in that moment. For in the town of Edgewood, and in the dark cabin on its outskirts, there was only silence, an oppressive silence that seemed to devour everything in its path, leaving behind only the faintest echoes of what might have been. Then, just as the last breath of warmth in the fire flickered out, a lone figure appeared on the horizon. The soft thud of hooves against the earth cut through the stillness, a solitary sound in the vast emptiness. Henry Hayes, a weathered cowboy, rode slowly into town, his horse's hooves clattering against the frozen ground. He had seen much in his time, but nothing prepared him for the quiet that had settled over the town, nor the eerie calm that seemed to hang in the air. He had heard the rumors, the whispers of something wrong, something hidden, but the truth had eluded him just as it had eluded everyone else who had come before him. As he made his way down the empty street, the darkness seemed to stretch before him, swallowing the town whole. The faint light from his lantern cast long shadows across the ground, painting the world in hues of yellow and black. It was then that he heard it, the faintest of sounds, almost imperceptible like a breath on the wind. Mama! The word was soft, fragile like a prayer whispered in the dark, a cry for help that barely escaped the lips of a child. It hung in the air, so small and delicate, yet so full of desperation it caught him off guard. His horse's hooves slowed as the sound reverberated in his mind, drawing him in like a magnet, pulling him toward a truth long buried. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to move at first. He had lived a long life, filled with the bitter tastes of hardship and sorrow, but nothing had prepared him for this. The wind seemed to hush, the world pausing as if to hold its breath. He dismounted, his boots crunching against the frozen earth as he made his way toward the source of the sound. The baby's cry echoed again, this time louder, more insistent. Mama! The words were impossible to ignore. He found the cabin at the edge of town, its windows dark, its door barely hanging on its hinges. The faintest glow of firelight flickered inside, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. Henry stepped closer, his boots scraping against the gravel, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. There was something wrong about the place, something that pulled at him, a sense of urgency he couldn't shake. He pushed open the door, and the smell of damp wood and cold earth hit him like a wave. The fire in the hearth was little more than embers now, struggling to stay alive. And there in the corner was the sack. It barely moved, but Henry's eyes caught the faintest of motions, a small, fragile twitch. He stepped forward, his heart heavy with a dread he couldn't explain. He reached for the sack, his fingers trembling as he lifted it, the fabric stiff with cold. Inside there was a baby, its skin pale and fragile, its tiny body curled in on itself as though it too had given up on life. Its face was streaked with dirt, its lips cracked from the cold. But its eyes were open, wide, and searching, looking for something, someone. "Mama!" The word slipped from its lips once more, so soft, so full of need. Henry's heart clenched in his chest. He had seen death in many forms, but this was something different. This was a cry for help, a cry from the forgotten corners of the world, from a place where life had no value. The baby's innocence, its helplessness, broke through the hardened walls he had built around his own heart. But as he knelt down to cradle the child in his arms, a deep question lingered in his mind. Who had done this? Who had left this innocent soul to die alone in the cold? And why? The town had turned away from its own, its people lost in their own fears and secrets. But the truth, Henry knew, was buried deep, hidden from view, a story yet to be told. The cabin stood silent, the air thick with the weight of the unspoken. The fire flickered, casting one last long shadow before it died completely, leaving only the pale light of the moon to fill the room. Henry held the baby close, his breath steady but his mind racing. The world had failed this child, but he would not. Not tonight. The mystery of the abandoned child, of the truth buried in the cold earth, would not stay buried forever. And somewhere in the deep shadows of that forsaken place, Henry Hayes knew that the answers would come. But for now, the silence of the night pressed in around him, a silence that would only be broken when the truth was finally uncovered. Some secrets, Henry knew, could never remain hidden for long. The wind swept through the streets of Edgewood with a chill that carried more than just the bite of winter. It carried the weight of years of hidden truths. The town, nestled on the edge of a forgotten frontier, stood quiet beneath the darkening sky, the kind of quiet that pressed against the chest like the weight of a secret never told. Beneath the surface of its cobblestone roads and neatly kept houses, Edgewood had long been a place of shadows, where whispers of the powerful mingled with the broken, where the lives of the poor were as disposable as the dirt they lived in. It was a place where stories were buried as deep as the roots of the old trees lining its streets, stories that no one wanted to remember but everyone felt the weight of. At the center of the town was the grand mansion of the Thornhill family, its ivy-clad facade a symbol of wealth and power in a land that had no use for either. Inside, the polished wood floors gleamed in the dim light of chandeliers, their crystals catching the slightest glint of sun that filtered through heavy curtains. The parlors were dark, filled with portraits of men and women long gone, their eyes cold and calculating, staring down at those who had dared to enter. It was in one of these rooms, behind a closed door, that the truth of Edgewood's shame was concealed. The child, abandoned and left to die, had been cast aside like an unwanted relic of a past no one cared to confront. She was nothing more than a stain on the reputation of the town's wealthiest family, a stain that no one dared to scrub away. The Thornhill mansion was built on secrets, on the kind of silence that allowed the powerful to thrive while the weak suffered. The town had long known of the injustices that festered within its walls, but none dared speak of them. The judge, once a man of respect, a figure who had dispensed justice with an air of infallibility, had long since discarded his role as protector of the people. His eyes, once filled with authority, now only held the reflection of his own guilt. His name had once been spoken with reverence, his decisions shaping the town's fate, but now that name was nothing more than a hollow echo. His mansion, filled with grand furniture and endless wealth, was as empty as his soul. He had buried the truth of his actions deep within the walls, hoping it would never resurface. But it was in those dark corners in the silence of the estate that the real story of Edgewood was hidden, locked away, never to see the light of day. As the weeks turned into months, the whispers began. The townspeople, once too frightened to speak, now gathered in darkened corners, trading rumors in hushed tones. It was vengeance, some said. A woman scorned, a father's shame, they whispered. Others spoke of the shame of a child born in secrecy, of a life too fragile to survive in a world that valued nothing but power. But none of them knew the full truth, not really. The town had long grown accustomed to the absence of justice, to the understanding that power could silence even the most desperate of cries. They had grown indifferent to the suffering of the weak, too consumed with their own lives to care. And in this silence, the truth grew darker, more distorted, until it could no longer be recognized for what it had once been. The mansion loomed over the town like a monument to corruption, its windows staring blankly out over the streets where the poor scraped by, their lives as disposable as the discarded rags they wore. The town's people moved in and out of their homes with a quiet resignation, as though they too were part of the lie that had been built around them. The judge's name, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a lie that no one had the courage to unearth. Those who knew the truth of the child's fate dared not speak. Fear of retribution held their tongues. The judge had eyes everywhere, and his wealth and influence reached into every corner of the town. He had made sure of that. The people had no choice but to remain silent, to pretend that everything was as it should be, even as the cries of the abandoned child echoed through their dreams. It was a silence that gripped the town like a disease, eating away at its soul. The cries of the baby, soft, desperate, had become a part of the town's nightly chorus, blending with the wind, the rustling of leaves, the creaking of old houses. No one acted, no one spoke out. The weight of the silence pressed down on them all, an invisible hand that kept them from reaching for the truth. The child, abandoned and forgotten, had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the town, and yet no one could bring themselves to confront it. No one could bear the shame of acknowledging the truth. It was easier to bury it, to ignore it, to pretend that nothing had ever happened. And so the judge's secrets remained buried, hidden behind the grandeur of his estate. His wealth had given him power, and power had given him the ability to erase any trace of wrongdoing. He had cast aside the child as if she had no value, as if her life had meant nothing. In the parlors of his mansion, the grandest of dinners were held, attended by those who had turned a blind eye to the suffering outside their walls. The judge sat at the head of the table, his face cold, his eyes calculating as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, beneath the mask of civility, the guilt of his actions festered, growing with each passing day. The weight of the silence was too much for some. In the dark corners of Edgewood, a few brave souls had begun to question what they had ignored for so long. The abandoned child, once a mere whisper, had become a haunting presence in their lives. Those who knew the truth of what had happened, who had seen the judge's cruelty firsthand, were now left to carry the burden of that knowledge. They lived with the weight of their silence, a silence that had allowed the town to continue on its path of indifference and denial. And as the years passed, the cries of the child faded into the wind, becoming just another part of the town's forgotten history. But the truth, no matter how deep it was buried, could not remain hidden forever. There would come a time when the weight of that silence would become too great to bear. And when that time came, when the truth was finally revealed, Edgewood would never be the same again. For in the quiet of its streets, in the dark corners of its grandest mansion, the truth had been buried, but not forever. Some secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, will always find a way to rise to the surface. And when they do, they will change everything. The dust of ages stirred in the still air, clinging to the walls of the mansion's library like forgotten memories. A slow, deliberate creak echoed through the room as Henry Hayes, the old cowboy, kneeled before the hidden space beneath the floorboards. His hands, rough from years of labor, trembled slightly as they pried the loose boards free. Beneath them lay a tattered, leather-bound ledger, its edges worn, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. The firelight from the hearth danced across the dark wood of the floor, flickering like a shadow of what had been. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, a smell that carried with it the weight of years spent buried in silence. Henry's fingers hovered over the pages, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the very earth that had kept this secret hidden. He could feel the history, the years of lies and secrets, wrapped in the fragile bindings of this book. Slowly, carefully, he turned the first page, and as the fragile paper cracked under his touch, the faintest traces of ink became visible. The writing was old, the words faded, but they were there, a confession written in the hand of someone who had long since passed. The words blurred at first, the ink thin and faded, but with a slight tilt of the page, they began to come into focus. The name was there, written clearly in the judge's elegant script, Elias Thornhill. Henry's breath caught in his chest as the truth began to unravel before him. The child, the one left abandoned in the cold, forgotten by all, was his. The judge's own flesh and blood. A child born from an affair, hidden away like so many sins that wealthy men had the power to bury. Henry paused, letting the weight of the words settle over him. The confession was stark in its simplicity, yet it revealed the depth of a crime that could not be undone. The affair was nothing more than a passing moment of indulgence, easily forgotten, easily erased. The woman, the mother, had been nothing more than a shadow cast aside in the wake of the judge's need to preserve his reputation. Her life, like so many others, had been disposable, easily discarded when it no longer served the interests of the powerful. But it was the baby, the innocent child, who had borne the cost of those decisions. The words on the page spoke of the infant's death, ordered by the judge himself. The child, a product of his shame, was to be erased, to vanish as if she had never existed. The power of the judge's position, his wealth, and his influence had made it possible. No one would question his authority. No one would challenge him. The baby, so small and fragile, was nothing more than an inconvenient truth, one that could be silenced with a flick of the judge's hand. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The child had not died that night. She had lived. And in living, she had exposed the fragile lies upon which the judge's power rested. The discovery of her existence, the revelation that the judge had not erased his mistake as easily as he had hoped, was a blow that shattered the facade of control he had so carefully constructed. The man who had once held the town in the palm of his hand, who had dispensed justice with an unyielding hand, was nothing more than a frightened soul hiding behind wealth and status. The realization struck Henry with a force that nearly took his breath away. This man, who had stood at the head of the town, wielding his power with such authority, was nothing more than a coward. He had hidden behind his riches, his name, and his position, afraid of the truth that had always threatened to unravel him. And now, that truth had emerged from the darkness, carried by the fragile pages of a long, forgotten ledger. The child, the forgotten soul he had tried to bury, had not only survived, but had become the instrument of his undoing. Henry leaned back on his heels, the ledger still open in his hands. The flickering firelight cast long shadows across the room, stretching across the walls like the specters of all the sins committed here. The judge, a man of power and influence, had thought he could silence the truth. But the truth, it seemed, had a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. As Henry sat there, the silence of the room weighed heavily upon him. He could feel the presence of those who had lived in this house, their ghosts lingering in the corners of the grand room. The grand portraits on the walls stared down at him, their eyes cold and distant, as if they too were aware of the secret that had been concealed within these walls. They had known. They had all known. The townspeople, the wealthy elite who had watched as the judge's power grew, had seen the baby abandoned, and yet they had turned their eyes away. They had ignored the cries, the desperate pleas, choosing to remain silent to protect the power that had given them their wealth. And now, the silence that had held Edgewood in its grip for so long seemed to crack, just a little. Henry's hands tightened around the fragile pages, his eyes scanning the words once more. The baby had lived. She had survived the night that was meant to be her end. And in surviving, she had become the beacon of truth that no one could ignore any longer. As the days passed, the weight of the truth began to spread through the town like a slow burn. The once unquestioned authority of Judge Thornhill was no longer enough to keep the town in line. The truth had found its way into the streets, into the whispers of those who had long been too afraid to speak. The child, abandoned and forgotten, was now a symbol of something far greater than just a victim of one man's shame. She had become the embodiment of all the suffering and injustice that had been swept under the rug for years. The judge's actions, his efforts to bury the past, had failed. And in his failure, the town could no longer pretend that it had not been complicit in his crimes. The whispers grew louder with each passing day, the truth spreading like wildfire. The child's story could not be ignored, not now, not when it had been dragged into the light. And as the truth spread, the judge's facade began to crumble. The man who had once wielded power over all, who had silenced dissent with a single word, was now a shadow of himself. The child, the forgotten soul he had tried to bury, had become the catalyst for his downfall. But the question remained, what would be done with this truth? The town had spent years hiding behind lies, behind a mask of civility, but now they had no choice but to face what had been hidden for so long. Would they rise to confront the injustice, or would they turn away once more as they had before? The truth had emerged, but the consequences had only just begun. Henry Hayes knew one thing for certain: the town would never be the same again. The hidden truth had come to light, and with it, the weight of the past had been placed squarely on the shoulders of those who had chosen silence over justice. Some truths, no matter how deeply they were buried, would always claw their way to the surface. And when they did, they would change everything. The years had a way of softening the sharp edges of memory, of quieting the whispers that once haunted the streets of Edgewood. Yet the truth, once buried beneath the weight of lies and silence, refused to be forgotten. It lingered in the corners of the town, like a shadow that stretched longer with each passing day. The mansion at the heart of Edgewood stood as a reminder of the price paid for power, its once grand walls now crumbling, its windows shattered, letting the wind whisper through the ruins. Time had taken its toll on the house, but it had also taken its toll on the town. The people of Edgewood could no longer hide behind the veil of ignorance. They could no longer pretend that the truth had not been unearthed. The echoes of the past reverberated through the years, and with them the truth of what had happened could no longer be ignored. The judge's name, once spoken with reverence, was now a hushed murmur that carried with it a weight of shame. Elias Thornhill, the man who had once held the town in his grasp, was now nothing more than a distant memory, a figure whose influence had crumbled in the face of the truth. His wealth, his power, none of it could shield him from the consequences of his actions. The town had learned, through the painful process of revelation, that power built on lies and cruelty could not stand forever. The mansion that had once been a symbol of authority now stood abandoned, its doors and windows open to the elements, the wind howling through its empty halls as though mourning the lives it had destroyed. As time wore on, the child who had once been discarded, forgotten, and left to die grew into a young woman, a figure of quiet resilience, her strength forged in the fires of abandonment and betrayal. Her name was no longer a whispered secret, her story no longer buried beneath layers of shame. She had become something more, something that Edgewood could not ignore. She was the heartbeat of the town's redemption, the symbol of the truth that had finally been brought to light. The people of Edgewood, once complicit in the silence that had allowed the judge's crimes to go unpunished, could no longer deny her presence. She was the living proof of what had happened, the living testament to the cost of a system that had ignored the cries of the vulnerable. Her journey was not one of vengeance, but of survival. She had lived, not only to prove that she existed, but to show that even the most fragile of lives could find strength. The town, once indifferent, now watched her with a mixture of awe and shame. The woman she had become was a stark contrast to the image of the helpless child abandoned so many years ago. She carried within her the weight of all that had been hidden, all that had been silenced, and yet she moved through the world with a grace that defied the cruelty she had faced. Her story was no longer just her own. It had become the story of Edgewood, a town that had lived in silence and fear, but now had the chance to find redemption. Henry Hayes, the cowboy who had uncovered the truth, often found himself standing at the edge of town, looking out over the land he had once ridden through. The hills that had once seemed so vast, so full of promise, now felt smaller to him, as though the weight of the truth had shrunk them. He had been the one to unearth the secret, the one who had stumbled upon the forgotten ledger, the one who had set everything in motion. But even he, a man who had spent his life riding alone, could not escape the ripple effects of the past. He had thought that uncovering the truth would bring him peace, but instead, it had left him with a sense of quiet sorrow. The cries of the abandoned child, once a soft whisper in the night, had become a resounding truth that echoed through the years, a truth that neither he nor the town could escape. Henry had hoped in those early days that the truth would heal the wounds of Edgewood. He had believed that once the lies were stripped away, the town would find its way back to a semblance of order, of justice. But as the years passed, he realized that redemption was not so easily won. The town had changed, yes, but so had he. There was no simple resolution to the tragedy of the past, no easy way to undo the harm that had been done. The mansion, standing like a silent sentinel at the heart of Edgewood, was a reminder of the cost of silence, of complicity. And yet, there was a quiet dignity in the way the town had begun to face its past. in the way the young woman had taken her place at the center of that reckoning. The town had learned something in the years since the truth came to light. It had learned that some things cannot remain buried forever. The truth, no matter how deeply it is hidden, will always claw its way to the surface. The mansion, with its crumbling walls and shattered windows, stood as a monument to the cost of power and silence. It was a monument to the lives lost, to the innocence stolen, to the secrets that had been hidden in the shadows. But it was also a monument to the resilience of those who had survived, to the courage of those who had refused to remain silent any longer. The truth, though painful, had been a catalyst for change, a change that was still unfolding in the streets of Edgewood. The bell in the town's church tower tolled one evening, its deep, mournful sound carrying across the landscape. The people of Edgewood had gathered as they had so many times before, but this time it was different. This time the town was not bound by the silence that had kept it chained to its past. This time the bell rang not for the judge, not for the power he had once wielded, but for the child he had abandoned. The child who had become a woman of strength and dignity, the child who had survived and in doing so had changed everything. As the bell echoed through the town, the people of Edgewood stood in quiet reflection. The weight of the past hung heavy on their hearts, but there was no turning back. The truth had been spoken, and with it, a new understanding had taken root. The judge's name, once a symbol of respect, had become nothing more than a shadow of shame. His wealth and power could not save him, for in the end, it was not his position that defined him, but the child he had abandoned. The child, whose life had once been written off as insignificant, had become the heart of the town's redemption. The people of Edgewood, standing in the shadow of the mansion that had once symbolized power and control, now understood that some truths could not remain buried. The house still stood, but the silence felt heavier now. The legacy of Elias Thornhill had crumbled, and in its place the truth had been laid bare. The bell tolled for both the victim and the sinner alike, for both the child and the man who had abandoned her. Some names only find peace once the truth is told. And in the quiet of that final toll, the town of Edgewood found a measure of peace, knowing that the silence had been broken, and the echoes of justice would carry on for generations to come.